B, me 29, software engineer at a mid-sized tech company. Not some flashy startup, just a regular place with decent pay, solid team, reasonable hours, been there about 3 years. At this point, good reviews, on track for senior role, nothing exciting, but nothing broken. Either life is stable. Then I met her. It was at a friend's birthday thing, one of those house parties where you recognize maybe half the people there and spend the first hour pretending to check your phone. She was near the kitchen talking to a small group, confident, sharp, the kind of person who holds a room without seeming like she's trying to. I ended up next to her when the group split off and we just started talking. She worked at a nonprofit, content and communications, writing and running social media for causes she cared about. I didn't know much about that world, but she explained it without making me feel like I should. 2 hours went by. Without either of us noticing, we exchanged numbers. Before I left, first couple of dates were genuinely good. She was funny, direct, had a take on everything I liked, that she wasn't vague about what she thought we'd disagree on things. And it felt like actual conversation, not two people just performing agreement to keep the peace by the end of the second month. We were spending most weekends together, by the third. It was basically official, without either of us making a big announcement about it. Her politics were pretty far left. I knew that from early on I'm somewhere in the middle. Never really cared that much about labeling myself. She'd talk about her work, the campaigns, the systemic problems they were trying to address. I'd listen and ask questions and sometimes push back a little. She seemed to like that. I didn't just nod along, or at least I thought that's what was happening. First sign, something was off. Came around month 4, we were at dinner talking about something in the news. I don't remember exactly what I said, something I thought was pretty reasonable. Something about trade-offs in a particular approach. She put her fork down and looked at me like I'd said something genuinely offensive. She said I was repeating talking points from people who benefit from keeping things the way they are. I asked which part of what I said was actually wrong. She said I was missing the bigger picture and centering the wrong voices. I let it go. Figured it was just one of those conversations. Except it kept happening, not constantly, not even most of the time, but often enough that I started noticing any time I questioned something she was certain about, the conversation would shift. Suddenly I wasn't engaging with an idea anymore. I was being defensive, or resistant to growth, or not fully there. Yet I started being more careful about when I pushed back, which in hindsight was exactly the wrong response, around month 5 or 6. She started making comments about my job, nothing direct. At first things like, must be nice to work somewhere that doesn't have to think about ethics. Or she'd ask if my company had sustainability policies and then make a face when I said I wasn't sure I worked in software, enterprise stuff, nothing glamorous but nothing sinister. I told her that she said that staying neutral was itself a political choice. I remember thinking that was a clever thing to say, and also really exhausting her friends. We're all cut from the same cloth. I met them gradually over those early months. Small dinners, events, group hangs. They were all smart, all passionate about something, all very certain. I got along okay on the surface with most of them, but there was always a slight undercurrent, like I was being evaluated without anyone telling me what the rubric was. Conversations sometimes felt like tests I hadn't been warned about. I passed enough of them that nobody said anything outright, but I could feel it whenever I missed something. My brother Dex met her twice in that stretch. He's older by 5 years, not a big talker, more of a watcher. After the second time, he pulled me aside and said something like, "She talks a lot about what she believes, but I haven't heard her ask you much about what you think." I told him she was just passionate about her work. He nodded and left it there. Dex doesn't push, he just says the thing once and lets you catch up to it on your own timeline by month 7. Things at home had a different quality. She was staying over more, which I was fine with. I liked having her around, but the apartment started feeling like a place where I had to run things through a filter before I said them. Not about safety or anything like that. Just this constant low-level awareness of how something might land. She made a comment once about a book I had on the shelf. Said the author had problematic views. I hadn't read it yet. It was a gift from a coworker. She suggested I donate it. I didn't, but I moved it to a drawer and stopped thinking about it. Work was going well. Through all of this, I'd been given a bigger project, more responsibility, real chance at a promotion. In the next review, Cycle was putting in more hours, which she picked up on. She started saying things about how I was prioritizing the corporation over us. I explained I was working towards something specific, that it would level off. She said that's what people who are conditioned to think that way always say. I actually laughed because I thought she was being ironic. She wasn't. There was one evening that stuck with me after we were watching something on the couch. I forget what a male character in it made a bad decision. The standard dramatic moment, she made a comment about how that's just how men are raised to think. See, I asked what she meant. Specifically, she went into this whole thing about toxic masculinity and how men are socialized from childhood to prioritize status and income over emotional connection and real relationships. I said something like, sure, some men, but that's pretty broad. She looked at me and said, I wasn't as self-aware as I thought I was. Just that, no example, no context. I asked what made her say that. She said I'd understand. Eventually, I lay there that night thinking about it longer than I should have. The months kept rolling, good stretches and harder stretches. The good ones were genuinely good, which is probably the main reason I stayed. She could still be funny and warm, still the version of her I'd met at that party. But the other version showed up more and more, the one where every conversation circled back to something I hadn't figured out yet. Or some way I was still behind. I told myself relationships take work, that I was probably being too sensitive about some of it, that nobody's perfect. Dex asked how things were going around month 8 or 9. I gave him a surface answer, something like, it's a lot sometimes, but overall good. He said, okay, and didn't push. I think he already had a clearer picture than I did. The thing about those months is that nothing was ever so bad that it felt like an obvious reason to leave. It was all incremental, small comments that accumulated, small adjustments I made to avoid friction, small moments where I swallowed something instead of saying it. None of it felt like a crisis, just friction. Just the cost of being in it. The apartment stopped feeling fully like mine. Somewhere in that period, I couldn't have told you exactly when it happened. Just at some point, I noticed I was moving through my own space, like I was a guest who'd been there a while. There was a work thing one evening, a small team dinner, nothing fancy, just the people I worked with, closely going out after a long sprint. I mentioned it to her in the morning. She asked who was going, and whether it was mandatory. I said it wasn't mandatory, but I wanted to go. These were people I worked with every day, and it was good to actually sit down with them outside of meetings. She said she didn't understand why I'd choose to spend more time in that environment, voluntarily. I said, because I like the people. She said something about how I'd probably like different people more if I'd ever been around them. I went anyway and had a perfectly normal evening and came home to a quieter apartment than usual and a short exchange about it that I tried not to read too much into. She had a way of framing things that made my life sound like a series of mistakes I hadn't recognized. Yet, my job was a cage I'd built for myself. My male friends from college were people I'd outgrow. Eventually, my tendency to want to think about both sides of something before committing to a position was fence-sitting, and evidence that I hadn't done the work. None of it was ever shouted. That wasn't her style. It was all delivered at a reasonable volume, like a series of observations from someone who could see more clearly than I could. I started keeping a loose mental tab around that period. Not intentional, just something my brain started doing, automatically tracking how conversations usually went. What kinds of topics reliably ended up with me being the one who was wrong. It was a long list, how I spent my time, who I spent it with, what I read, what I cared about at work, how I thought about money, what I wanted for the future. There was almost nothing on the other side of the ledger, almost no space where I had been right about something or where she had adjusted toward me rather than the other direction. At one point I brought this up directly, not accusatorially, just honestly said something like, I feel like the adjustments only seem to go one way. I'm always the one who needs to change something, she said. That was because she'd already done her work, and I was earlier in the process. I asked how she knew that. She said it was pretty clear from how I talked about things I let it go, because I didn't know how to argue against a premise that was set up to be unfalsifiable. Dex called me once during that stretch, just to talk. Nothing specific. I spent most of the call describing my week at work, because I didn't want to get into the relationship stuff. Again near the end, he asked how she was doing. I said, fine. Same as usual. He said, same as usual, good, or same as usual, complicated. I said, a bit of both. He said, okay, and we wrapped up. I sat there after the call thinking that a bit of both had been pretty charitable. There was a stretch in there where I genuinely tried to see it from her side, not performatively, actually tried to understand where she was coming from. She grew up around people who talked about systems and power and who gets harmed by what decisions that becomes the lens through which you see everything. I get that. And I understand why someone with that lens looks at a guy in a mid-sized tech company and fills in a particular story about what that means. The problem is, she never actually asked me what it meant to me, never asked what I cared about, or what I was building toward, or what kind of person I considered myself to be. She had the answer already before the question was asked. I was the type who needed to change, and the change meant moving toward the version of me she'd already sketched out. That was the part that was genuinely hard to sit with. Not the disagreements themselves. I can deal with disagreements. I actually like them when they're real. It was the sense that my own experience of my own life wasn't valid data. In the conversation, she had a framework and I was supposed to fit inside it. And every time I didn't fit cleanly, the framework wasn't questioned. I was the shift into something harder to ignore. Happened the way most things do. Gradually, and then all at once, the job stuff was always there, but it got louder. What used to be offhand comments became actual arguments she'd gotten more involved in her organization's work, running bigger campaigns, putting in longer hours, talking more intensely about what the work meant and required. Somewhere in that process, my job became less of a background irritant and more of a central problem in how she talked about us. She started using the word corporate, the way people use words they want to land, like an accusation. I worked in software, wrote code, sat in meetings, fixed things that were broken. None of it felt like something I should be ashamed of, but in her framing it was participation in something harmful. By definition, I asked her once to explain specifically what harm my particular job caused. She said that was exactly the kind of question someone inside the system would ask. After that, I mostly stopped asking. She got really into this idea of values alignment during that stretch. She'd encountered the phrase somewhere. One of the writers she followed had talked about it, or she'd seen it. Discussed in her circles, the concept was that in a real partnership, both people had to share core values, not just get along on the surface. I thought that was reasonable enough in the abstract, but the way she applied it meant my values had to align with hers. Specifically, anything different wasn't a difference between two people. It was a deficiency on my end. I was still working through my conditioning, or not fully there yet, like I was somewhere on a journey she'd already completed, and was now waiting for me at the destination. She started recommending things I should read and watch and follow. At first I engaged with some of it genuinely, wanted to understand what mattered to her. But the list kept expanding, and the tone shifted from sharing to assigning. If I hadn't gotten to something she'd mentioned, she'd bring it up again. If I had gotten to it and had something to say that wasn't total agreement, she'd explain why I was interpreting it wrong. It was hard to explain to anyone outside of it, because each individual moment was small, but the accumulation was real and it was constant. The promotion came through around that time. Senior engineer, meaningful raise, more interesting work going forward. I was genuinely happy about it. Called Dex first, then called her. Her response was something like, "That's great, more money to keep you locked in." I assumed she was joking and laughed. She wasn't laughing when I got home that evening. She said congratulations and hugged me, but the conversation moved on, almost immediately. She shifted to something from her own day. I remember sitting there thinking that the biggest professional thing that had happened to me in years had gotten about 4 minutes of airtime before she changed the subject. Her friend group had started feeling more closed off. As things went on, I'd met everyone by that point, gotten through the surface level with most of them. But there was a shared language inside that group that I was never quite inside of. Specific phrases, specific references, a shorthand that signaled you were on the correct side of something I'd try to keep up. And sometimes I'd miss a beat, and there'd be this small pause in the conversation. Nothing loud, nothing anyone would point to. Just a pause her closer friend was more openly pointed about. It never said anything to me directly, but had a consistent way of redirecting when I was speaking or asking questions phrased to put me at a disadvantage. I mentioned it to her once, said something felt off there. She said I was being paranoid, that her friend was just a lot, but meant well. I left it alone. There was a dinner at her place. Just us, a couple of months before everything ended. We were talking about the future in a loose way, not concrete plans. Just the kind of conversation you have about where things are going. I mentioned thinking about buying a place in a few years, that my savings were in a solid position. For it, she said she didn't see herself in the suburbs. I said I wasn't thinking suburbs necessarily. Just somewhere with more room that somehow became a conversation about gentrification, which became a conversation about how my financial priorities reflected my class background, which became her saying she wasn't sure we wanted the same things out of life. I asked what she meant. She said I needed to think seriously about what I was working toward and whether it aligned with a meaningful life. I drove home that night, feeling like I'd lost a debate I didn't know had started. I talked to Dex properly after that dinner. Not the surface version I'd been giving him, actually told him what had been going on. The job comments, the book she'd wanted me to donate, the way every disagreement came back to me, being the one who hadn't grown enough. The promotion that got 4 minutes, he listened to all of it without cutting in. Then he said, it sounded like she'd already decided who I was supposed to become, and was just waiting for me to figure it out. I said I thought I could work through it, if we actually talked about it. Honestly, he said, okay, and left it there, but saying it out loud to someone else made it sit differently. She went on a weekend trip with her friends, somewhere, a few hours away, came back different. Or, I started seeing things more clearly. I'm not sure which, more certain, more energized, more pointed in how she talked about my life. Specifically, she'd been talking with her friends about relationships, about what real partnership looked like in practice. She started using a phrase she hadn't used before. Proving loyalty through action. Not just words, she said. Genuine commitment meant being willing to actually change. That staying comfortable was an active choice to stay stuck. I asked what specifically she thought I needed to change. She didn't answer directly, said, I should sit with the question. I sat with it for about a week. The more I sat with it, the less I liked what I was looking at. We had a decent stretch after that, a couple of weeks that felt more like the early days. I want to be honest about that because it wasn't all one thing. Even near the end, she could still be the person I'd met, still funny, still warm when she let herself be. And that made everything harder because it felt like something real was in there worth holding on to. But underneath the good days was the same thing that had been building for months, this sense of being on probation, of not having cleared some test that was always running in the background. No matter what I did, the verdict seemed to already exist somewhere, waiting the week before the dinner that ended everything. She brought up the job. Again, we were having coffee in the morning before I had to leave. She said she'd been thinking about us and what it meant that I was still in that environment. I asked what specifically she meant. She said the work I did, the company I worked for, the culture of that world was incompatible with the direction she wanted her life to go. I said I was good at what I did, that it paid well, that I'd put years into getting where I was. She said that was exactly the problem, that I'd built my identity around something hollow and hadn't noticed I finished my coffee and left. Without saying anything else, thought about it the whole way to work, thought about it through the first 2 meetings of the day, thought about it on the walk to get lunch. By the time I sat back down at my desk, I had a pretty clear sense of where things were going. That week had a different quality to it. She was calm, almost deliberate, like someone who had made a decision and was now waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Looking back, it was obvious in the moment. I think I was still trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it felt. There was a night during that week where we watched something together, and she made a comment partway through something about how the male lead was displaying classic avoidance behavior, refusing to be emotionally honest because of how men are conditioned to see vulnerability as weakness. I said I thought the character was just introverted. She looked at me and said that introverted was often a word men used to avoid confronting the real issue. I asked what the real issue was. She said a lifetime of being told that feelings are inconvenient. I said I didn't feel like I was someone who avoided feelings. She said that's usually how it presents. We watched the rest of it without talking much. I went to bed thinking about that exchange longer than it deserved. She also started being more deliberate about the things she chose not to say. There were moments where I'd say something, and she'd just look at me with this particular expression. Not angry, not dismissive, something more like patient disappointment, like a teacher waiting for a student to hear their own mistake. I started dreading that expression more than I dreaded the arguments. The arguments at least had a shape, a beginning and an end. The expression just hung there, and I was supposed to fill in what it meant, I thought, at certain points about what it would look like to actually do what she was asking. Not specifically about the job thing, that came later, just the general direction she was pointing. Become someone who talked about values, the way she talked about values, see the world through the framework she used, give up the parts of my life she'd decided were incompatible with who I was supposed to be. I tried to imagine what would be left after that. and I kept coming up short. I couldn't find myself in the version she was describing. There was a day at work, somewhere in the middle of all of it, where I had a genuinely good day solve something that had been blocked for a week. One of those problems that clicks when you finally look at it from the right angle. Team was happy. My manager mentioned it in the channel. Small thing. But it felt good. I remember walking to my car at the end of the day feeling like myself, in a way that had become less common at home. I noticed that contrast and then tried not to think about what it meant. She came by the office once, just dropping something off. I'd left something in her car. She stood in the lobby for maybe 10 minutes while I came down. On the way back up, I thought about what she'd seen: regular office building, regular people doing regular work. And I knew she'd looked at it and seen something confirming whatever she already thought. I could have introduced her to the people I worked with. People who were smart and decent and actually pretty interesting. But I already knew how that would land. They'd be categorized within the first few minutes, and the category would say more about her framework than about them. The week before, the dinner that ended everything, she brought up the job. Again, we were having coffee in the morning, before I had to leave for work. She said she'd been thinking about us, and what it meant that I was still in that environment. I asked what specifically she meant. She said the work I did, the company I worked for, the culture of that world, was incompatible with the direction she wanted her life to go. I said I was good at what I did, that it paid well, that I'd put years into getting where I was. She said that was exactly the problem, that I'd built my identity around something hollow, and hadn't noticed I finished my coffee and left, without saying anything else. Thought about it the whole way to work, thought about it through the first 2 meetings of the day, thought about it on the walk to get lunch. By the time I sat back down at my desk, I had a pretty clear sense of where things were going. The dinner was at one of her closer friends' apartments. Not a big group, 5 people including us. I knew everyone there at least a little. Had been in rooms with all of them before something felt different from the moment I walked in, but I couldn't name it exactly. Not hostile, just settled, like an arrangement had already been made, and I was the last to arrive at it. First part of the evening was normal enough on the surface: food, conversation, people talking about work and what was going on in their lives. I kept up, made a couple of comments that landed, thought maybe I'd been reading the week wrong, then the conversation shifted in a way that didn't feel accidental. One of her friends asked how things were going with us. She answered before I had a chance to say anything, said things were at a crossroads. I stayed quiet and waited to see where it went. She started talking about the conversations we'd been having, about values and direction, and what she'd been patient about framing it, like she'd been holding something back for a long time, and had finally decided to bring it into the open. She started talking about what real loyalty looked like in practice versus in words. The friends were nodding. I sat there understanding that this wasn't a dinner. She looked at me and said it directly, in front of everyone in that room. She said that if I was serious about a future with her, I needed to quit my job. She said the company I worked for, the world I worked in, was fundamentally at odds with her values and with who she was trying to be, and that staying there was a daily choice I was making, to prioritize something hollow over something real. This was how I could prove I was actually willing to change. She said it evenly, like she'd rehearsed the words enough times that they came out smooth. The room went quiet. Everyone looking at me, I looked at her for a long moment, trying to find some version of this that was a conversation and not an ultimatum being delivered with an audience present as witnesses. I asked if we could talk about this privately. She said there was nothing to discuss privately, that this was who she was and what she needed, and that she'd been clear about that. One of the friends said something about how growth requires real discomfort and real sacrifice. I didn't look at her. I kept looking at her. I thought about the months, the book in the drawer, the promotion that got 4 minutes before she moved on to her own day. The way every disagreement came back to something I hadn't figured out yet. The phrase "prove your loyalty" running in the background of the last few weeks. I thought about what saying yes would actually mean. Not just the job, that wasn't really the point. It would have been the beginning of the next thing on the list, whatever that turned out to be, because the list didn't have an end. I could see that. Now I pushed my chair back from the table, stood up. She asked where I was going. I said I was leaving. She said if I walked out that door, I was making my choice. I said I understood that. She said I was being reactive, that I should calm down and think about what I was throwing away. I said I had thought about it. Then I picked up my jacket, said a general goodbye to the room, and walked out the front door. The drive home was quiet. I called Dex somewhere in the middle of it, didn't say much, just that I'd left and wasn't going back. He said to come over if I didn't want to be by myself. I said I was okay, that I'd call him tomorrow, and I actually was okay, which was the part that surprised me. Not happy, not relieved in any clean way, just quiet, like something that had been running loud in the background for a long time had finally stopped. And I could hear the room again. The messages started, before I even got home, first from her, then from a couple of the friends who'd been at the table. She went through a few different things. In sequence started with me, having embarrassed her in front of people she cared about, shifted to me, running away from growth and from someone who was trying to make me better. Then a stretch of messages that were more hurt than angry, more confused than accusatory, then something about men and emotional immaturity and not being able to handle a real conversation. I read all of it that night and didn't respond to any of it. The next few days were about logistics. She had things at my place. I had a few things at hers. We handled it through messages, kept them short and factual. She tried a few times to turn the logistics into a bigger conversation about what had happened and what I was actually walking away from. I kept redirecting to the practical stuff. Drop-off arrangements, what belonged to who. Dex came over sometime in that first week. We didn't have a long debrief about it, which was exactly what I needed. He helped move her things into the hallway, so they'd be ready when she came by. We ordered food afterward and watched something neither of us was really paying attention to. At some point, he just asked if I was doing all right. I said, yeah. Mostly he said, okay. And that was the whole conversation. That's how Dex works. And it's exactly right. Some of the mutual adjacent people did the predictable thing online, the unfollowing, the quiet removal from group chats. I understood how that worked. The friends who were actually mine checked in and then didn't make it into something larger than it was. I appreciated that the messages from her slowed down over a couple of weeks and then stopped. I didn't reach out to find out how she'd explained it to people or what the version of the story was. In her circle, I didn't look at her profile, didn't ask anyone who might know. I had a pretty complete picture. Already work was still there. Same project, same team, same cadence of stand-ups and reviews and the occasional fire drill. What I noticed was how much mental space the relationship had quietly taken up, without me realizing it. The commute felt different. The mornings felt different. I could have a thought and just follow it without immediately running it through some filter about how it would land. I thought about her sometimes in that stretch, not constantly, but in waves. Mostly I thought about the version from the beginning, the person at the party, the 2 hours by the kitchen talking about nothing and everything. That part I actually did miss. But when I followed the thought past that, into the months after, the weight of all the small adjustments I'd made, the drawer the book ended up in, the promotion I'd stopped mentioning after 4 minutes, the way I'd learned to pre-filter what I said before I said it, I didn't miss any of that. And the thing at the dinner, the ultimatum delivered to a room full of nodding witnesses, not even a little what I kept coming back to over the weeks after, wasn't anger, more like clarity. The relationship had a ceiling I hadn't been told about, no matter what I did, no matter how much I showed up or adjusted or tried to meet her where she was. There was always going to be another thing, another level of proof required, another way I hadn't changed enough yet, another version of myself I was supposed to be working toward, but never quite reaching. That's not a partnership. That's an audition that never ends. The book went back on the shelf. Somewhere in that period, I didn't make a thing of it, just took it out of the drawer one morning and put it where it had been. Dex and I were out with a couple of guys a while later. Nothing special, just an evening out. Someone who didn't have the full story asked if I was seeing anyone. I said not. Right now, they asked if I was looking. I said eventually. Probably, which was true. I'm not the type to decide. I'm done with the whole thing. I just got clear about what I'm not willing to do. Again, Dex asked me once, not right after but later. When enough time had passed, asked if I thought I'd made the right call. I thought about it for a moment, said, yeah, I did. He said, good. Finished his drink. We talked about something else. I kept my job still there. Still writing code, still going to stand-ups, still working on the thing I've been building toward for 3 years. It's not glamorous and it's not saving the world by anyone's definition. But it's mine and I'm good at it. And nobody gets to take that and call it hollow. Not without hearing something back. I ran into someone from her friend group once, a few months out just in passing, a coffee place near where I work. We made brief eye contact. She gave me the kind of nod you give someone when you know them, but don't want to open anything up. I gave the same nod back, got my coffee and left. Didn't think about it much. After the thing that surprised me most about the months that followed was how little I wanted to relitigate it. I thought I'd spend a lot of time replaying conversations, finding the moments where something could have gone differently, but I didn't. Not really. The picture was pretty clear. By the end, she had already decided what kind of person I was and what kind of person I needed to become, and those two things were always going to be in conflict, because she got to define both of them. There wasn't a version of that equation where I won by playing the game. I went back through some of the early messages once. The first few weeks of us talking, she was different in text than she was in person. Warmer, funnier, less certain about everything I remembered, liking that version. A lot. I think that version was probably real too, just not the only version. The thing about people is they're usually more than one thing. At once she genuinely believed what she believed, and she genuinely cared about it. She also genuinely thought I was a project that needed completing and wasn't quiet about it. Both of those things were true, and both of them mattered. Dex and I talked about it properly once. Maybe 4 months out, not the events we'd covered that. More like what I thought about it from a distance. I told him I didn't feel like I'd made a mistake. I felt like I'd seen something clearly eventually, and then acted on it. He said that was the right way to think about it. Then he said something about how he'd noticed early that she talked a lot about what she was against, and not as much about what she was. For I asked why he hadn't said more at the time, he said. Because I had to see it myself, that it wouldn't have landed coming from him. He was right about that. Things are pretty normal. Now work is good, the senior project went well, there's something bigger on the horizon that I'm looking forward to. The apartment is fully mine again, in every sense. I rearranged a few things, bought something for the wall that I liked, put some stuff back where it had been. Before I started editing the space, I see Dex regularly, see my friends, live the life I was already living before all of it started. I'm not swearing off anything, not the type, but I know what I'm not willing to do. Again, I'm not building a smaller version of myself to fit inside someone else's framework, not calling that growth. And I'm definitely not quitting my job to prove something to a room full of people who had already made up their minds before I sat down